My girlfriend's best friend helped me catch her cheating. That sounds like the beginning of a revenge story. It wasn't. 4 months into my relationship, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. A few small changes, a few strange excuses, a feeling I couldn't shake. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if something was actually wrong, so I made a decision that would change all three of our lives. I asked her best friend for help. I thought we were going to find the truth. What I didn't expect was that the investigation would take us in a completely different direction. And by the time we finally got our answer, the person I was worried about losing wasn't my girlfriend anymore. This is how it happened. Scene 1. Something doesn't feel right. 4 months. That was how long I'd been dating Megan Brooks. Not long enough to talk about marriage, not short enough to still be figuring out whether we liked each other. Things were supposed to be getting easier. Instead, they were getting confusing. The problem wasn't that Megan was acting badly. The problem was that she was acting almost exactly the same. She still called me, still replied to my messages, still wanted to spend time together. Yet over the last few weeks, a small feeling had settled into the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. At first, I ignored it. Then I explained it away. Then I started noticing things. Thursday nights. Every Thursday she was busy. Work dinner, networking event, client meeting, company function. The reasons always sounded reasonable. But after the 4th week in a row, I found myself waiting for the next excuse before she even gave it. Then there was her phone. Nothing dramatic. No suspicious messages popping up. No secret calls in the middle of the night. Just little things. The screen facing down. A smile appearing while reading a message. The phone disappearing into her purse the moment I looked over. Tiny things. The kind of things that shouldn't matter. Except they did. One Friday evening we were having dinner together. I was halfway through a story about a disaster at work when I noticed Megan smiling at her phone. Not listening, not paying attention, just smiling. I stopped talking. A few seconds passed before she looked up. "Oh, sorry. What were you saying?" I forced a smile. "Nothing important." The rest of the dinner was fine, normal. But later that night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about that moment. Not because she'd looked at her phone, because she'd looked happier reading that message than she'd looked talking to me. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was being insecure. I genuinely hoped that was the case. For nearly 2 weeks I argued with myself. Every time I decided I was overreacting, something else happened. Every time I convinced myself everything was fine, the feeling returned. Eventually I reached a point where I couldn't keep wondering. I needed an answer. Unfortunately, I had no idea how to get one. Then I thought about Sophie Reed, Megan's best friend. I'd met her a few times, not enough to know her well, just enough to know she seemed honest, the kind of person who didn't play games. The idea felt ridiculous, completely ridiculous. But 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Sophie in a coffee shop. She looked confused and slightly concerned. "Okay," she said. "Your text sounded serious. What's going on?" There wasn't really a polite way to ask, so I just asked, "Do you think Megan is seeing someone else?" Sophie's eyes widened. "What?" A couple at the next table glanced over. She lowered her voice. "Jake, where's that coming from?" I told her everything. The Thursday nights, the growing distance, the strange feeling that something wasn't right. As I spoke, her expression slowly changed. Not because she believed me, because she realized I genuinely didn't know what to think. When I finished, Sophie sat quietly for several seconds. Finally, she sighed. I've never heard her mention another guy. Part of me felt relieved. Another part didn't, because the feeling was still there. "I know this sounds crazy," I said. "No." I looked up. "No?" Sophie shook her head. "It sounds like someone who's worried." For some reason that felt better than being called paranoid. She stirred her coffee for a moment, then looked at me. "I don't think Megan is cheating." The knot in my stomach loosened slightly. But, she continued. My stomach tightened again. But if something is going on, you deserve to know. I stared at her. What are you saying? A small smile appeared on her face. I'm saying maybe we find out. I blinked. We? She pointed at me. You started this, then pointed at herself. And, unfortunately, now I'm involved. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. A real laugh. Sophie smiled. Neither of us knew it then, but that simple conversation didn't just start an investigation. It started a partnership. And before it was over, it would change all three of our lives. Scene 2, the first lead. 3 days later, Sophie called me. Not texted, called. The moment I answered, she sounded serious. Are you busy? Not really. Good. There was a pause, then, I think I found something. My stomach immediately tightened. What? Nothing definite. That's not helping. I know. Another pause. Can you meet me downtown in 30 minutes? I was already grabbing my keys. Neither of us talked much during the drive. The coffee shop confidence from a few days earlier had disappeared. Now that we might actually find something, neither of us seemed excited, just nervous. When I arrived, Sophie was waiting outside an office building. She pointed toward the entrance. Megan works on the 12th floor. I nodded. I know. Her Thursday meetings. What about them? I asked around. I looked at her. You asked around? I'm not proud of it. That meant she was slightly proud of it. What did you find? Sophie crossed her arms. Nobody knows what the meetings are. I frowned. What does that mean? It means everyone knows she leaves. And nobody knows where she goes. That wasn't proof of anything, but it wasn't comforting either. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Sophie sighed. I was hoping I'd find a simple explanation. So was I. That evening, we found ourselves sitting in a small cafe across the street from an upscale restaurant. Not because we were detectives, not because we had some brilliant plan, simply because Sophie had discovered Megan was heading there after work. Neither of us knew what we expected to find. Maybe nothing. Honestly, I hoped it was nothing. The entire situation felt ridiculous. I hated sitting there, hated watching the door, hated feeling like I was spying on someone I cared about. Across from me, Sophie looked equally uncomfortable. After 10 minutes, she quietly spoke. I feel awful. I looked up. What? This is my best friend. I know. She stared through the window. If she's innocent, I'm going to feel terrible. I nodded. If she's innocent, I'll buy both of us dinner for a month. That finally earned a smile. Only a month? I'm not made of money. The smile disappeared as quickly as it came, because at that exact moment, Megan appeared. Both of us immediately went silent. She entered the restaurant, alone, at least initially. I watched her sit down near the window, then check her phone, then look toward the entrance, waiting. My stomach sank, because she looked like she was expecting someone. 5 minutes later, the door opened. A man entered. Mid-40s, expensive suit, confident walk. The kind of guy who looked like he belonged in executive meetings. He spotted Megan immediately, and smiled. She smiled back. Then he sat down. Neither Sophie nor I said anything. We simply watched. The conversation seemed comfortable, natural, familiar. Too familiar. The man wasn't touching her. Nothing romantic was happening. No hand-holding. No flirting that we could see. Just talking. Yet neither of us could ignore the fact that Megan looked happier than she had in weeks. After nearly 40 minutes, Sophie quietly asked, "Do you know him?" I shook my head. No. Work? Maybe. Neither of us sounded convinced. The dinner continued. Conversation, laughter, more conversation. Nothing happened, and somehow that made it worse, because there was nothing concrete, nothing we could point at, just questions, more questions than before. Finally the man stood. Megan stood too. They walked toward the exit. I unconsciously leaned forward. Sophie did the same. Outside the restaurant they stopped. The man said something. Megan laughed. Then they walked toward the parking lot together. Still no touching, still no obvious evidence. Yet neither of us moved. We simply watched them disappear. For several seconds there was complete silence. Finally I leaned back in my chair. I don't know what to think. Sophie stared through the window. Neither did she. After a moment she quietly said, I wish we'd found nothing. I looked at her. The concern in her voice was genuine. Not for me, not for herself. For Megan. Because if something was happening, her best friend was about to hurt someone, and Sophie knew it. Me too, I admitted. The waiter arrived with the bill. Neither of us had touched our coffee. We paid and stepped outside. The evening air felt colder than before. For a few moments we simply stood there. So what now? I asked. Sophie looked toward the parking lot where Megan and the older man had disappeared. Then she sighed. Now we find out who he is. For the first time since this whole thing began, I realized something. This wasn't a feeling anymore. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't insecurity. There was actually something to investigate, and neither Sophie nor I were sure we wanted to know where it would lead. Scene 3. Following Mr. Mystery. The problem with deciding to investigate someone is that eventually you have to actually investigate them, and neither Sophie nor I had the slightest idea how to do that. 3 days after the restaurant sighting, we met in a parking lot on a Saturday morning. Sophie arrived carrying a coffee. I arrived carrying confidence. Only one of those things lasted more than 5 minutes. Okay, Sophie said. What's the plan? I stared at her. I thought you had a plan. She stared back. I thought you had a plan. That was the moment we discovered neither of us had thought beyond finding the guy. We did manage to identify him. His name was Richard Collins, 46, senior vice president at a large consulting firm, divorced according to the internet. At least that's what one website claimed. Another claimed he was married. A third claimed he lived in Florida. So basically we knew nothing. What we did know was that he had a routine. Saturday mornings, same coffee shop, same time, same table. Which was why Sophie and I were currently sitting across the street pretending not to watch him. Do you think he knows we're here? She asked. No. Good. A few seconds passed. Because we're being very obvious. I looked up. What? Sophie pointed. Richard was looking directly at us. My stomach dropped. We immediately looked away, trying to act natural, which somehow made us look even more suspicious. 20 minutes later, Richard left. The moment he walked outside, Sophie sat up. Okay. Okay, what? We follow him. I blinked. We? She pointed at me. You're driving. I sighed. That's not a reason. It absolutely is. Following someone in movies looks easy. Following someone in real life is terrifying. For the first 10 minutes, I was convinced Richard would notice us. For the next 10 minutes, I was convinced we'd lose him. Then somehow both things happened. At the same time. We lost him at a traffic light. Sophie groaned. I can't believe this. I rubbed my face. We followed him for 20 minutes. And? We are terrible at this. That wasn't encouraging. Fortunately, Richard was apparently a creature of habit, because 30 minutes later we spotted him again, this time walking through a shopping district. Sophie immediately became determined. We're not losing him again. 5 minutes later, we lost him again. By lunchtime, both of us were frustrated. We sat in a small diner reviewing our complete lack of progress. What have we learned? Sophie asked. I thought about it. He's rich. Already knew that. He drinks expensive coffee. We knew that too. He walks surprisingly fast. That's the most useful thing you've said all day. I couldn't argue with that. The afternoon finally gave us something. Richard entered another restaurant. Not upscale, not fancy, just a normal place. We waited outside, watching, hoping, expecting Megan to arrive. She never did. Instead, after 40 minutes, Richard left with another woman. Not Megan, not even close. Different age, different hair, different everything. Sophie and I exchanged a look, then followed them. Maybe this woman was important. Maybe she was part of the mystery. Maybe... 5 minutes later, the woman kissed a man outside a bookstore. A completely different man, then got into his car. Richard waved goodbye and walked away. I stopped. Sophie stopped. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. I think that was his sister. Why? Because if that wasn't his sister, we just spent an hour investigating a completely innocent family lunch. I thought about it. Unfortunately, she was probably right. For the first time since we'd started, Sophie laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. The kind you try to suppress and fail. I looked at her. What? She shook her head. We have no idea what we're doing. I wanted to disagree. I really did. But she was right. We had spent an entire day following a man, lost him twice, learned nothing useful, and somehow ended up investigating what was probably a sibling relationship. The ridiculousness of it finally hit me. A second later, I started laughing too. Soon both of us were standing on the sidewalk, laughing like idiots. People walked around us. Nobody understood what was happening. Honestly, neither did we. Eventually, the laughter faded. For a moment, we just stood there. The tension that had existed since the restaurant seemed slightly lighter now. Not gone, just lighter. Sophie smiled. Same time next week, detective? I shook my head. We are definitely not detectives. Good point. She started walking toward her car, then glanced back. But we're going to figure this out. For the first time, I noticed something. When we'd started this, Sophie was helping me. Scene 4, the binocular incident. By the 4th week of our investigation, Sophie and I had developed something that looked suspiciously like a routine. Every few days, one of us would discover a lead. The other would pretend it wasn't a terrible idea. Then we'd waste several hours proving it was, in fact, a terrible idea. It had become surprisingly normal, which was probably not a good sign. Thursday evening found us sitting inside my car across from an outdoor restaurant. This time we had reason to be there. Megan had left work early, Richard had left work early, and both had somehow ended up at the same restaurant. For once, we weren't guessing. We were actually following something real. The problem was that absolutely nothing was happening. They were sitting outside, talking, eating, laughing, just like every other time. No touching, no flirting, no evidence. Just enough to keep us suspicious, not enough to prove anything. Sophie lowered the binoculars and sighed. I swear these two have the most boring secret relationship in history. I laughed. Maybe because it isn't a secret relationship. She handed me the binoculars. You still believe that? I want to. That was the truth. A part of me still hoped all of this had some innocent explanation. A work mentor, a business opportunity, literally anything. Because the alternative meant I'd wasted months on someone who didn't deserve them. A few minutes later, Sophie grabbed the binoculars again. She stared for several seconds, then frowned. What? She kept looking. I don't get it. What don't you get? She lowered the binoculars. The guy. I laughed. What about him? She pointed toward Richard. Look at him. I looked. Okay. He's old. I rolled my eyes. You've mentioned that. I'm serious. He isn't that old. He's old enough. I shook my head. Sophie, that's not evidence. I know. Then what are you saying? She looked back through the binoculars, then spoke without thinking. What is she even seeing in him? I shrugged. Maybe she likes him. Sophie immediately snorted. Why? I looked at her. What do you mean, why? She lowered the binoculars. Come on. What? Look at him. Then she pointed at me. Look at you. I blinked. What? You're younger. I stared. Sophie continued, completely unaware of the damage she was causing. You're funnier. Sophie. You're smarter. Sophie. And honestly, she stopped, only now realizing where the conversation was heading. Unfortunately, it was too late. The words came out anyway. Honestly, who goes looking for someone else when they already have a guy like you? Silence. Complete silence. Even the traffic outside seemed quieter. For a second, Sophie looked confused. Then realization hit. Her eyes widened. Oh. I stared. She stared. Neither of us moved. Neither of us seemed capable of moving. Sophie's face turned bright red. She immediately raised the binoculars. Suspect is drinking water. I blinked. What? Suspect is still drinking water. I couldn't help smiling. Sophie. Very suspicious water. Sophie. I am conducting important surveillance. The smile spreading across my face refused to leave. And judging by the way Sophie refused to look in my direction, she knew it. 10 minutes later, neither of us had mentioned the conversation again, mostly because Sophie seemed determined to pretend it had never happened. The problem was that I couldn't stop thinking about it, not because she'd complimented me, because she'd sounded sincere, completely sincere, like she'd genuinely meant every word. That realization was strangely dangerous. The evening became even stranger an hour later. Richard and Megan finally left the restaurant. We followed them. Carefully. Or at least we tried to. They entered a shopping district. Sophie and I followed from a distance. Everything was going well, until Richard suddenly stopped. My heart nearly exploded. Why is he stopping? I don't know. Did he see us? I don't know. Richard turned around, directly toward us. Panic. Pure panic. Without thinking, Sophie grabbed my arm and pulled me into the nearest store, a bridal boutique. I realized where we were at exactly the same moment the saleswoman approached. She smiled warmly. Welcome. Neither Sophie nor I spoke. The saleswoman looked between us, then smiled even wider. Oh, how exciting! Sophie froze. I froze. The woman clasped her hands together. When's the wedding? The next few seconds were a disaster. Sophie answered first. September. At exactly the same moment I answered, June. The woman blinked. We blinked. Then Sophie forced a smile. We're flexible. The woman nodded. Apparently that made sense. For the next 5 minutes we were trapped inside a bridal store, pretending to be an engaged couple while trying to avoid being noticed by the people we were actually following. When we finally escaped, Richard and Megan were gone. Again. We had lost them. Again. But somehow, neither of us seemed very upset. Back at the car, Sophie rested her head against the seat. We are the worst investigators in America, I laughed. No argument here. A moment later, she smiled. The small, genuine smile I'd started seeing more often. The one that appeared whenever she forgot to be careful. And for the first time, a strange thought crossed my mind. If this investigation ended tomorrow, I wasn't sure I'd be happy about it. Because somewhere along the way, spending time with Sophie had stopped feeling like part of the investigation and started becoming the best part of my week. Scene 5. The Pond Incident. By this point, Sophie and I had been investigating Megan and Richard for almost a month. We still didn't know what was actually happening. We had theories, lots of theories. Unfortunately, most of them turned out to be wrong. The only thing we'd learned with complete certainty was that neither of us should ever become private investigators. Saturday morning found us following Richard through a large public park. The plan was simple. Stay far enough back not to be noticed. Watch where he went. Try not to embarrass ourselves. Historically, the third part was always the hardest. Richard walked ahead on a winding path. Sophie and I followed from a distance. So, what's our current theory? I asked. Sophie thought for a moment. He owns 3 secret companies. Reasonable. He's an international spy. Also reasonable. He has a hidden underground lair. I nodded. Most reasonable one so far. She laughed. I knew you'd understand. The conversation had become strangely easy over the past few weeks. When we'd started this investigation, every interaction had felt awkward. Now we spent hours together without thinking about it. Neither of us seemed to notice the change. Or maybe we noticed and ignored it. Suddenly Sophie pointed. There. I turned. What? Richard. I looked where she was pointing. Unfortunately, I also took 2 steps backward while doing it, a decision I immediately regretted. My foot hit something, then nothing. For one glorious second, I windmilled my arms like a man fighting for his life. Sophie! Splash! The pond won. Cold water exploded around me. Mud followed shortly afterward. A few ducks fled the scene, probably out of embarrassment. I surfaced a second later, soaked, covered in pond water, hair hanging into my eyes. For a brief moment, Sophie looked genuinely concerned. Jake! Then she saw me properly. The concern disappeared, instantly. She pressed both hands over her mouth, trying desperately not to laugh. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then she completely lost control. The laughter echoed across the park. People turned to look. A child pointed. An elderly couple stopped walking. Meanwhile, Sophie was bent over, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. I stood in the pond, dripping, humiliated. You are a terrible person, she nodded. I know. More laughter. You should be helping. I know. Even more laughter. At one point, she actually had tears in her eyes. That somehow made it worse. 20 minutes later, we were standing near a public restroom. My clothes were completely soaked. My shoes squished every time I moved. My dignity had drowned in the pond. Sophie was carrying my shirt and jacket. What exactly is the plan? I asked. The hand dryers. You think that'll work? No. Then why are we doing it? It's all I've got. Fair enough. 10 minutes later, Sophie was inside trying to dry my clothes. Meanwhile, I was hiding behind a large group of bushes. The arrangement wasn't ideal. I was standing there wearing only my boxers. Fortunately, the bushes were tall. Unfortunately, only my head was visible above them. A jogger passed, looked at me, looked at the bush, then increased his speed considerably. I couldn't blame him. A few moments later, a woman walking her dog approached. The dog immediately started barking, loudly, very loudly, at me. The woman stared. I stared back. Neither of us knew what to say. Eventually, she simply walked away. The dog continued judging me. A few minutes later, Sophie emerged carrying my shirt. She took one look at my situation and immediately started laughing again. No. Yes. No. The dog part really happened. I pointed toward the path. The dog hates me. She leaned against a tree trying to recover. Jake. What? You look ridiculous. Thank you. You're welcome. Eventually, the shirt was dry enough to wear. The jacket was another story. Apparently, hand dryers were not designed for full detective emergencies. Who knew? As Sophie continued working on it, I sat on a nearby bench. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The laughter had faded. The morning had become quiet, comfortable. Sophie looked over. I noticed her staring. What? Nothing. That's never true, she smiled. No, it really isn't. I waited. After a moment, she shrugged. I was just thinking. Dangerous. Very. I pointed at the jacket. Thinking about how much money you're going to make selling that story? Actually, I was thinking this isn't how I expected the investigation to go. I smiled. Getting attached to the case? She looked at me for a second. A little longer than normal, then quickly looked away. Something like that. The answer felt strangely important, though I wasn't entirely sure why. By the time we finally returned to the car, the entire day had been a disaster. We'd learned absolutely nothing about Richard, lost track of him completely, wasted hours, and yet neither of us seemed upset. As I started the engine, Sophie looked over. "You realize nobody would believe this story." "What story?" "The one where a man falls into a pond while investigating his girlfriend." I laughed. "Good point." A few seconds passed, then Sophie smiled. "We're definitely leaving the pond part out when we tell people." I glanced at her. "No." "What?" "That'll be the best part." She rolled her eyes. But she was smiling. And for the rest of the drive home, we talked more about the pond than the investigation. Neither of us realized it yet, but the mystery was slowly becoming less important. Because somewhere between the wrong suspects, the bridal shop, and the pond disaster, I had started looking forward to spending time with Sophie. And judging by the smile she wore the entire drive home, I wasn't the only one. Scene 6. The Rain Shelter. A week after the pond incident, Sophie and I were once again accomplishing absolutely nothing. Richard had left another restaurant. We had followed him through half the city, and somehow learned less than when we started. At this point, our investigation had developed a pattern. We'd discover a promising lead, follow it, lose it, then spend the rest of the evening questioning our life choices. This particular evening was no different. We were walking back toward my car after another failed attempt. "So what did we learn tonight?" I asked. Sophie thought for a moment. "Richard likes seafood." Useful. "He tips 20%. Groundbreaking. He owns at least 4 blue ties." I nodded. "The case is practically solved." Sophie laughed. The sound came easily now. A month ago we barely knew each other. Now we spent entire evenings together. Neither of us seemed willing to examine that fact too closely. The first raindrop landed on my shoulder, then another, then several more. Both of us looked up. Dark clouds. Very dark clouds. "Oh no," Sophie said. The sky immediately proved her right. Rain exploded from nowhere. Not a drizzle, not a shower, a full-scale attack. "Run!" We took off, half laughing, half panicking, searching for cover. The nearest shelter turned out to be a tiny bus stop, and by tiny, I mean it had probably been designed for 2 very optimistic people. We reached it seconds before the rain became impossible. By then, both of us were already wet. I stepped inside first. Sophie squeezed in beside me, then immediately realized there wasn't enough room. The rain was blowing sideways. To stay dry, she had no choice but to move closer. Very close. Her shoulder pressed against mine, one hand resting lightly against my arm. The space between us disappeared completely. Neither of us said anything. The rain hammered against the roof. Cars splashed through puddles. The city continued around us. Yet somehow everything felt strangely quiet. I became painfully aware of how close Sophie was. The smell of her shampoo, the warmth of her shoulder, the fact that every time either of us moved, we'd accidentally touch. It shouldn't have mattered. For some reason it did. Beside me, Sophie wasn't having an easier time. She was staring very intensely at the rain, as if the rain was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. It wasn't. She knew it. I knew it. Neither of us mentioned it. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The rain showed no intention of stopping. Finally, Sophie cleared her throat. "So?" I nodded. "So." Brilliant conversation. A minute later, Sophie quietly spoke again. "You know?" "What?" She hesitated. For a second, it looked like she was about to say something important, something real. Instead, she shook her head. "Nothing." I looked out at the rain. Ironically, I'd been about to do the exact same thing. I was going to say something too. That got her attention. "What?" For a moment I considered answering honestly. Then common sense returned. "Nothing." Sophie's laugh was small, nervous, relieved. Maybe all 3. "Good." "Good?" Because I wasn't ready for a serious conversation. I smiled. Neither was I. The strange thing was that neither of us believed that. Eventually the rain slowed, then stopped. The moment it did, Sophie stepped away. The sudden distance felt oddly noticeable. "Well," she said quickly. "Yeah. We should probably go." "Probably." Neither of us moved. Then both of us laughed. At ourselves. At the situation. At whatever had just happened. The drive home was unusually quiet. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. At one point, Sophie turned down the radio, then turned it back up again, as if she'd changed her mind halfway through a conversation. I nearly laughed, because I'd done the exact same thing 3 times already. When I finally dropped her off, Sophie opened the door, then paused. "See you this weekend?" The question came too quickly, too naturally, like she already knew the answer. I smiled. "Yeah." She smiled back, then disappeared inside. I sat in the car for another minute, staring at the building, thinking about the investigation. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was a little more complicated, because for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't sure whether I was looking forward to solving the mystery or just looking forward to seeing Sophie again. Final scene, case closed. 2 weeks after the rain shelter incident, Sophie called me on a Thursday afternoon. The moment I answered, I knew something was different. "Jake." "What?" "I found them." I sat up immediately. "Where?" "The Riverside Hotel." There was a pause. Then Sophie quietly added, "I think this is it." For the first time since this whole thing began, neither of us made a joke. Neither of us laughed. This felt different. 40 minutes later, we were sitting inside my car across the street from the hotel, watching, waiting. Neither of us talked much. The investigation had consumed almost 2 months of our lives. The wrong suspects, the restaurant stakeouts, the pond, the bridal shop, the rain shelter, the detective notebook. All of it had led here. And strangely enough, I wasn't thinking about Megan. I was thinking about Sophie, about how much I enjoyed seeing her, about how much I was going to miss this if it ended. Then Sophie's voice interrupted my thoughts. "There." I looked up. Megan had arrived. A few minutes later, Richard appeared. Together they entered the hotel, and all we could do was wait. 30 minutes later, the doors opened. Megan and Richard stepped outside, talking, laughing, walking close together. Then Richard stopped, turned toward her, and kissed her. A real kiss. Not something that could be explained away. Not a misunderstanding. Not a business meeting. Not a friendship. The mystery was over. For a second, neither Sophie nor I said anything. Then something unexpected happened. A smile slowly appeared on Sophie's face. Not because Megan was cheating, not because we'd been proven right, but because after months of uncertainty, we finally had an answer. I looked at Sophie. She looked at me. And somehow we both started smiling at exactly the same time. The kind of smile that comes when a weight you've been carrying suddenly disappears. The kind of smile that says, "It's finally over." Neither of us felt angry. Neither of us felt heartbroken. The strange thing was that seeing Megan kiss Richard wasn't the happiest part of that moment. Seeing Sophie smile was. Because in that instant I realized something. The investigation was ending, but whatever was happening between us was just beginning. Suddenly Sophie threw both hands into the air. "Yes!" I stared at her. "What?" "Yes!" I couldn't help laughing. "Sophie, you just celebrated my girlfriend cheating." She immediately pointed at the hotel. "No." "What?" "I celebrated solving the case." That was it. The tension finally broke. I started laughing. Sophie started laughing. Soon both of us were laughing so hard we could barely breathe. Months of stress disappearing in seconds. Still laughing, Sophie stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. A spontaneous victory hug. I hugged her back. Neither of us let go. For a moment we simply stood there, the world fading into the background. Then Sophie looked up. I looked down, and for the first time, neither of us pretended not to see what had been growing between us. I leaned forward and kissed her. Sophie's eyes widened. For half a second, she looked completely stunned. Then she laughed. A soft, happy laugh. The kind that said she'd wanted this too. Before I could apologize, she grabbed my jacket, pulled me back, and kissed me. This time longer. When we finally separated, both of us were smiling like complete idiots. "So," Sophie said. "So," I replied. "What do we do now?" I looked toward the hotel entrance and grinned. We closed the case. Still holding hands, we walked toward Megan and Richard. The moment Megan saw us, her face went pale. Then she noticed our hands, and somehow became even paler. "Jake?" I smiled. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I glanced at Sophie, then back at Megan. "Good news." She looked confused. "What?" "We finally solved the mystery." The horror on her face was immediate. Beside her, Richard looked equally uncomfortable. I turned toward him, then offered my hand. Richard stared at it, slowly shook it. "Thank you." His confusion was immediate. "For what?" I smiled. "Honestly, if this investigation hadn't happened, I never would have ended up with Sophie." For the first time in my life, I watched 4 people become confused simultaneously. Sophie started laughing. Richard looked alarmed. Megan looked horrified, and I couldn't stop smiling. Then Megan snapped. "You were spying on me?" Sophie raised a hand. "For almost 2 months." Richard nearly choked. 2 months? I shrugged. "Relax. We only know about the affair." The word hit Richard like a brick. "Affair?" I frowned. "Yeah." Then his expression changed. The expression of a man who had just realized he made a very expensive mistake. He looked at Megan, then at me, then said, "Wait." Nobody spoke. "You didn't know I was married?" Silence. Absolute silence. Megan slowly turned toward him. "What?" Richard closed his eyes. Too late. Way too late. "You told me you were divorced." Richard didn't answer, because there wasn't a good answer. I looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at me. Then both of us took a step backward. This was clearly no longer our problem. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Good luck with all that." Then we walked away, still smiling, still laughing, without looking back. A few weeks later, Richard vanished. Whether he was afraid of exposure, afraid of his wife finding out, or simply didn't want the drama, nobody knew. What everyone did know was that he disappeared from Megan's life overnight. The promotion she'd hoped for never happened. The relationship she'd gambled everything on wasn't even real. And for the first time, she had nobody left to blame except herself. 3 months later, Sophie and I were sitting in a restaurant. Actually on a date, not a stakeout, not an investigation, just dinner. The conversation eventually drifted back to the case. "The pond," Sophie said. I groaned. "No." "The pond." "No." "The dog." I pointed at her. "The dog was aggressive." "The dog was correct." I laughed. She laughed. And for a moment we simply sat there, happy, comfortable, exactly where we belonged. Finally, Sophie shook her head. "You know something?" "What?" "We were terrible detectives." I smiled. "No." She raised an eyebrow. "No?" I reached across the table and took her hand. "We found exactly what we were looking for." Her smile softened. "The truth?" I shook my head. "No." "Then what?" I squeezed her hand. "You." And for once, neither of us had any reason to keep investigating. The case was finally closed. Thank you for listening. Jake started this journey looking for the truth about the wrong person. But somewhere between the stakeouts, the wrong suspects, the pond, the rain shelter, and 100 terrible detective decisions, he found the right person standing beside him the entire time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more wholesome romance stories, unexpected twists, and happy endings. And remember, sometimes the best thing you find isn't what you're looking for, it's who you're looking beside. See you in the next story.